Hey there, friend. Welcome back. Today we're going into something that most people get completely wrong, and I mean completely wrong, when they try to understand political communication. We're not talking about spin. We're not talking about lying. We're not doing a cynical breakdown of how politicians manipulate the masses with dark arts and shadowy techniques. That's not what this is, and I want to be upfront about that right from the start. Because I think the moment most people hear the phrase, "speak like a politician," they immediately picture someone dodging a question, somebody sweating under studio lights, somebody saying a whole lot of nothing in a very confident voice. And sure, that exists, that happens, but that's not what we're exploring today. What we are exploring is the actual craft behind political speech, the structure, the strategy, and the persuasion mechanics that the best communicators in politics have mastered over decades, and in some cases over centuries. Because here's the thing that most people never realize: the techniques that make a great political speaker also make a great leader in a boardroom. They make a great parent in a difficult conversation. They make a great friend when someone needs to hear something true but hard. They make a great professional in any field where communication is the difference between being heard and being ignored. And in today's world, that's every field. So let's go deep. Let's really break this down, because whether you want to run for office, give a presentation that actually lands, lead a team through uncertainty, or simply become someone whose words carry weight, this is for you. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk about the foundational structure of political speech and why it works on a psychological level that most people never examine. We're going to talk about message discipline, what it actually means, how it's built, and how you can use it without sounding like a robot. We're going to dig into the specific rhetorical devices that politicians have borrowed from the ancient Greeks and still deploy every single day in modern media. We're going to talk about how great political communicators handle adversity, the hostile question, the gotcha moment, the crisis, and what their techniques can teach all of us about holding our ground without losing our dignity. We're going to explore the art of the memorable phrase and how certain lines get carved into history while others disappear the moment they're spoken. And we're going to talk about authenticity, because the whole thing falls apart without it. You can master every technique in this script, but if you don't understand the authenticity piece, none of it will work. Let's start at the very beginning. The foundation: why political speech is different from ordinary conversation. Most of us speak reactively. Someone asks us something, we answer. Someone challenges us, we defend. Someone praises us, we thank them. Our speech is largely a response to what's happening around us. We're reactive communicators, and for the vast majority of our daily interactions, that's completely fine. It works. You don't need a communication strategy to order coffee or tell your partner about your day. But political speech, and really any high-stakes communication, doesn't operate that way. Political speech is proactive. It is architected. And that is the single most important distinction you need to understand before anything else. When a skilled political communicator walks into a room, whether that room is a press conference, a town hall, a televised debate, a one-on-one interview, or a speech before 10,000 people, they are not waiting to see what happens and then responding. They have already decided 3 things before they open their mouth. They have decided what they want the audience to think, feel, and do when the communication is over. Read that again. Think, feel, and do. 3 things. Not just think, not just feel. All 3. Because political communication that only changes what people know is a lecture. Communication that only changes what people feel is manipulation. But communication that works on all 3 levels, that shifts someone's understanding, connects to their emotions, and moves them toward an action or a belief, that is persuasion. And persuasion, used ethically, is one of the most powerful and underrated skills a human being can develop. Now, most people will go their entire lives communicating only about the first level. They'll focus entirely on facts. They'll say, "Here is the information," and then feel frustrated and confused when no one seems moved by it. They'll wonder why their boss doesn't see the value of their proposal, why their team doesn't feel energized by the plan they've laid out, why the people they're trying to reach just don't seem to respond. And the answer, almost always, is that they've been speaking to people's minds without ever reaching their hearts or their feet. Political communicators learn, sometimes through painful experience, sometimes through formal training, that information alone never moves people. Never. You can pile up facts and statistics and evidence and logical arguments until you run out of breath, and most of the time, the people you're speaking to will walk away unchanged. Not because you were wrong, not because your evidence wasn't solid, but because the emotional and motivational dimensions of the communication were completely missing. This is why the foundation of political speech isn't information delivery. The foundation of political speech is understanding your audience at a deep level, understanding what they already believe, what they're afraid of, what they hope for, what they feel has been taken from them, and what they dream about for the future. And then, and this is the crucial part, speaking to all of those things in a way that makes your message feel not like new information coming from the outside, but like a confirmation of something they already knew on the inside. The best political communicators don't introduce you to new ideas. They give you language for ideas you've already been carrying. They name the thing you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. And the moment that happens, the moment someone hears a speaker give voice to something they've been holding silently inside, something clicks, emotional connection is made, trust is established, and everything that follows is heard with a completely different quality of attention. Think about the speeches and the communicators that have moved you in your life. Think about the lines you still remember years after you heard them. I'd be willing to bet that what made those moments powerful wasn't that someone told you something you'd never thought before. It was that someone told you something you'd always known in a way you'd never been able to say yourself. That's the foundation. That is where it all begins.
Knowing your audience, the research most speakers skip. Here's where things get practical. Before you can speak effectively, before you can structure a message, before you can deploy rhetoric, before you can craft a memorable line, you have to do the work that most communicators are too impatient or too arrogant to do. You have to genuinely understand the people you're speaking to. Not who you think they are, not a caricature of who they are, not a demographic profile that reduces them to their zip code and their voting history. Actually, genuinely, humbly understanding them. Political communicators who are great at this are almost always people who are great listeners first. They talk to people in diners and at factory gates, and in community centers and at school board meetings, not because they're performing relatability, but because they're gathering intelligence. They're listening for the language people use, not just the issues they raise, the specific language, the metaphors, the grievances, the hopes, the stories. Because here's what most people don't understand about political communication. The words people use to describe a problem matter just as much as the problem itself. If your constituents talk about the healthcare system being rigged against working people, and you get up and give a speech about systemic inefficiencies in the delivery of medical services, you are technically talking about the same thing, but you are communicating in completely different languages. Yours is the language of policy documents. Theirs is the language of lived experience, and lived experience always wins. The best political speech borrows its language from the audience. It hears how people talk about their lives and reflects that back to them with clarity and purpose. This is sometimes called meeting people where they are, and it sounds almost condescending when put that way, like you're lowering yourself to someone else's level. But it's actually the opposite of condescension. It's respect. It's saying, your experience is real.
Your language is valid, and I care enough about speaking with you, not at you, to learn how you actually talk. So before you speak, you listen, you ask, you read, you absorb, you collect the language that already exists in the room, and then you use it. There's a technique some political speechwriters call the quote audit. Before drafting any major speech, you go find real people, real voters, real community members, real employees if it's an organizational context, and you collect the actual sentences they say about the topic you're going to speak about. Then you look for patterns, recurring phrases, recurring metaphors, recurring emotional themes, and you build your speech around those patterns, not by copying their words directly, but by speaking in the same register, with the same emotional texture, with the same underlying values. When done well, an audience hears a speech built this way and thinks, this person gets it, this person understands. What they're actually experiencing is the recognition of their own language coming back to them, elevated and clarified. And that feeling of being understood, is one of the most powerful emotional experiences a human being can have in a public setting. It is also, not coincidentally, the foundation of trust.
The three-part structure that never goes out of style. Now let's talk structure. Because here's something fascinating. Across vastly different political traditions, different historical periods, different cultures and contexts, there is one structural pattern that keeps appearing in effective political speech. It's almost embarrassingly simple when you name it, and yet it is violated constantly by speakers who mistake complexity for sophistication. The structure is, tell them the problem, tell them the cause, tell them the solution. Or, in its more ancient formulation, what is wrong, why it is wrong, and what we do about it. That's it. That's the skeleton of almost every effective piece of political communication ever delivered. Every variation, every flourish, every structural innovation eventually comes back to this three-part spine. And here's why it works. Human beings are narrative creatures. We think in stories, and stories have a shape. Something is not right, here's why it's not right, here's how it gets right. That's a story. That's the oldest story structure in human history. The problem, the cause, the resolution. When a speaker violates this structure, when they give the solution before they've established the problem, or when they're so absorbed in diagnosing the cause that they forget to offer any resolution, or when they skip the emotional establishment of the problem entirely and go straight to policy prescriptions, they lose the audience. Not because the audience is unsophisticated, because the audience is human, and humans need the narrative arc. We need to feel the weight of what's broken before we can feel the hope of what might be fixed. Let's talk about each of the three parts in detail. The problem section is doing several things at once. It is establishing the stakes. It is creating emotional investment. It is making the audience feel that what is about to be discussed matters, that it's real, that it touches their lives. The problem section is not the place for facts and figures. It is the place for story. For example, for the vivid human illustration that takes an abstract issue and makes it concrete and felt. The best political communicators almost always open by anchoring the abstract in the specific. Not millions of people are struggling with healthcare costs, as true as that is, but I met a woman in Columbus, Ohio, a teacher, single mother of two, who told me she'd been putting off a medical test for 18 months because she was afraid of what the bill would be. That one story, that one human being, does more work emotionally than any statistic ever could. This is because of something psychologists call the identifiable victim effect. Our brains are not wired to feel emotional impact proportional to scale. We can intellectually understand that 10 million people are suffering, but we don't feel it at 10 million times the intensity of one person's suffering. In fact, we sometimes feel less when the numbers get too big, a phenomenon called psychic numbing. But one person, named, specific, real, standing in for all the rest, that one person we can feel. Great political communicators know this in their bones. Every big, abstract problem needs a human face. Every policy proposal needs to be traceable to a specific life it will change. This is not manipulation. It is the basic grammar of emotional communication. The second part, the cause, is where analytical credibility gets established. This is where you demonstrate that you don't just see the problem, you understand it. You've thought about it. You know what's driving it. And this is crucial, because audiences don't just want a leader who feels their pain. They want a leader who has a grip on reality. The diagnostic section is where you prove that grip. But here's the mistake that many political communicators, especially policy-heavy ones, make in this section. They get lost in it. They love the diagnosis so much, they spend so long in it, they pile in so much complexity that by the time they emerge to offer a solution, the audience has checked out. They're overwhelmed. They feel the situation is too complicated to be fixed, or they simply feel buried under detail. The cause section should be illuminating, not exhausting. It should make the audience feel, "Oh yes, I see it now. I understand what's been happening. I understand why my life has been what it's been." That's a feeling of clarity and even relief. It's not a feeling of being lectured. Keep the diagnosis tight, 2 or 3 root causes at most, and make sure each one is traceable back to the human story you opened with. The third part, the solution, is where energy must build. This is where the speech has to lift, where the language has to become more vivid, more active, more forward-looking. The problem section lives in the present tense, sometimes the past tense. The cause section is analytical, somewhat detached, but the solution section lives in the future tense and the active voice. We will do this. We are going to build this. Together, we can create this. Notice that pronoun shift, we, not I, not even necessarily you, we. Because the solution section is not just about what a leader will do, it's about what a community will do together. It's about collective agency. And collective agency is enormously powerful emotionally, because it removes the passivity that people feel when they're told about a problem. You're no longer a victim of the situation. You're an agent in the solution. That shift from passive recipient to active participant is one of the most energizing moves a political communicator can make. Message discipline, the skill most people misunderstand. Let's talk about something that gets a lot of cynical coverage in media analysis, but is actually, at its core, a genuinely important communication skill: message discipline. Most people, when they hear message discipline, think it means memorizing talking points and robotically repeating them no matter what anyone asks you. And yes, that's a degenerate version of message discipline. That's what it looks like when it's done badly. That's what people are rightly mocking when they point and laugh at a politician who pivots from a question about their personal life to a rehearsed line about their tax policy for the 17th time. But underneath that cynical surface, underneath the media training caricature, there's something real and genuinely useful. Message discipline, at its core, means knowing what you are trying to communicate before you open your mouth and having the skill to come back to that core message regardless of how the conversation unfolds. Think about the times in your own life when you've walked out of a conversation feeling like you failed to say what you actually meant. You were asked about something, you started talking, one thing led to another, you followed a thread, you got pulled into a discussion you didn't want to be in, and by the end, the actual point you wanted to make never got made at all. The other person walked away with a completely different impression of your thinking than the one you meant to give. That's what a lack of message discipline feels like from the inside. Message discipline is not about being dishonest or evasive. It's about being intentional. It's about knowing, before you enter any communication, what the 2 or 3 things are that you most need this person or this audience to walk away understanding, and then having the conversational navigation skills to keep returning to those things, even as the conversation moves around. Political communicators call their core message their message box. It's usually built around a very small number of ideas, sometimes just one central idea,
with a few supporting pillars, and the discipline is in returning to that box every time you feel the conversation pulling you away from it. Here's how it works in practice. Let's say your core message is that investment in public education is the single most powerful economic driver available to a community. Now you're in an interview, and the interviewer asks you about a completely different topic, let's say a local zoning dispute. You engage with the question honestly, you give your actual view, and then, and this is the move, you find the bridge. You find the genuine connection between what you were asked about and what you most need to say. That's message discipline done well. The key phrase there is genuine connection. The bridge has to be real. It can't be a non sequitur. It can't be an obvious pivot that insults the intelligence of whoever's listening. The best political communicators are not just disciplined, they're also genuinely knowledgeable and genuinely thoughtful enough to find the real connecting tissue between almost any topic and their core message, because they've thought about their core message so deeply that they can see it in everything.
This is actually one of the underrated benefits of having a clear core message. When you know deeply what you believe and why you believe it, when you've thought through all the implications and connections, you can find honest pathways back to it from almost anywhere. You're not performing message discipline, you're expressing a coherent worldview, and there is a profound difference in how that lands with an audience. Building your message box requires a kind of ruthless editing that most people find uncomfortable. Most of us have many things we want to say, many beliefs, many priorities, many pieces of evidence we find compelling. Message discipline asks you to select, to choose which things are central and which things are supporting, and to let the rest go, at least in any given communication. That selection process is itself a form of clarity. What do you actually believe most? What is the beating heart of your position? If you could only say one thing, one sentence, what would it be? Most people find that question surprisingly hard to answer. They hedge, they qualify, they add conditions, and sometimes those conditions are genuinely necessary. Reality is complicated, and intellectual honesty requires nuance. But there is also a version of hedging that isn't intellectual honesty at all. It's just fear. Fear of being pinned down, fear of being proven wrong, fear of losing some segment of the audience who might disagree with a clear position. That kind of hedging, the kind driven by fear rather than genuine complexity, is corrosive to trust. Audiences feel it immediately, even if they can't name it. They experience it as evasiveness, as slipperiness, as a lack of authentic conviction. And people will forgive a lot from a communicator who clearly and genuinely believes what they're saying. They will not forgive the feeling of being handled. So message discipline, done right, is actually a form of courage. It's the courage to say, here is what I believe. Here is what matters most to me. Here is the thing I need you to understand. And here is why I keep returning to it, no matter where this conversation goes.
The Rhetoric Toolkit, Ancient Weapons for Modern Communication. Let's get into the actual mechanics of persuasive language, because there is a toolkit, a genuinely learnable set of rhetorical devices that the world's most effective political communicators use and have been using for a very long time. Some of these devices go back to ancient Athens. Some were named and codified by Aristotle, and they're still being deployed in press conferences and campaign rallies and televised debates today because they work. They work on the human brain in ways that are consistent across time and culture because they map onto something fundamental about how we process and respond to language. You don't need to memorize the Latin names, though I'll give them to you because they're worth knowing. What you need to understand is the function, what each device does, why it works, and how you can use it. Let's start with the most foundational distinction in all of rhetoric, because everything else builds on it. Aristotle identified 3 modes of persuasion, and he called them ethos, pathos, and logos. If you've heard these terms before and glazed over, stay with me, because understanding them not as abstract categories, but as active ingredients in any persuasive communication changes how you hear and how you speak. Ethos is credibility. It is the audience's perception of who you are, your character, your competence, your trustworthiness. And here's the crucial thing about ethos. It is not established by telling people how credible you are. It is established by everything about the way you show up, your knowledge, your consistency, your willingness to acknowledge what you don't know, your track record, the specificity and accuracy of your claims, your comportment under pressure. When a political communicator gets up to speak and says, "I've spent 30 years working on this issue," that's an explicit bid for ethos, but the real ethos in the room has already been established before that sentence was spoken. The audience has been reading a speaker's body language, their eye contact, their tone of voice, the way they handle unexpected moments, the quality of their preparation. Ethos is built or destroyed in the aggregate of all of those signals, not in the explicit credential claiming. This matters for practical reasons. If you walk into a high-stakes communication, a job interview, a board presentation, a difficult negotiation, and your primary strategy is to list your credentials and tell people why they should trust you, you've misunderstood the mechanics of credibility. Trust is not given in response to a request for it. Trust is the inference people draw from everything they observe about you. The way to build ethos is to be genuinely prepared, to demonstrate real knowledge, to speak with precision rather than vagueness, to acknowledge uncertainty honestly, and to show through your behavior that you care about getting things right rather than just winning the argument. Pathos is emotional appeal. And I want to spend some time on this one because it is systematically misunderstood by people who like to think of themselves as rational. The word pathos has a negative connotation in a lot of intellectual circles. It sounds like manipulation, like playing on emotions, like bypassing the rational mind to reach the irrational one. And when pathos is used dishonestly, that's exactly what it is. But here's the thing. Emotions are not irrational. Emotions are information. They are the way our nervous system communicates to our conscious mind about what matters. Fear is information that something threatening is near. Grief is information that something we valued has been lost. Hope is information that a desirable future is imaginable. Anger is information that something unjust has happened. When a political communicator engages your emotions honestly, when they tell a story that makes you feel the weight of a real person's struggle, or when they paint a picture of a future that genuinely could be better, they're not bypassing your rationality, they're completing it. They're giving the rational information and emotional context that allows you to understand what it means, what it costs, what it's worth. The manipulation version of pathos, the dishonest version, is when emotions are invoked in service of claims that don't hold up to scrutiny, when fear is manufactured about threats that aren't real or inflated beyond their actual magnitude, when grief is weaponized to short-circuit legitimate debate, when hope is sold for a future that the speaker knows is not achievable. The honest version of pathos is when the emotional content of a communication is proportional to the real stakes, when the stories told are true, when the future imagined is genuinely possible if the work is done. Learn to use pathos, but use it honestly. The emotional temperature of your communication should match the emotional reality of what you're communicating about. Logos is logical argument, the structure of your reasoning, the quality of your evidence, the coherence of your conclusions. And in political communication, logos is often either overdone or underdone, almost never calibrated correctly. It's overdone when a speaker buries their audience in evidence without ever giving them the emotional and narrative context to understand why the evidence matters. It's underdone when a speaker relies entirely on emotional appeal and story without ever giving the audience the factual and logical scaffolding that allows those emotions to attach to real-world substance. The great political speeches balance all three: ethos, pathos, logos, because each one alone is insufficient. Ethos alone is just authority without content. Pathos alone is just emotion without basis. Logos alone is just information without meaning. But all three together, a credible speaker making an emotionally resonant case supported by sound reasoning and evidence, that is the full package of persuasion.
Now let's get into specific devices. The first and probably most powerful is anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. You know anaphora from some of the most famous speeches in history. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. Churchill. I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day. King. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Obama. Why does anaphora work? On a cognitive level, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates a sense of truth. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and when we hear a pattern being established, we lean toward it. We start to anticipate the next iteration. There's a tension, a pleasurable tension, in hearing the repeated phrase and waiting to see what follows it. On an emotional level, anaphora has a drumbeat quality. It's rhythmic. It builds. Each repetition adds energy to the one before it. And by the time you reach the final instance of the repeated phrase, the accumulated weight of all the previous iterations is behind it, making it land harder than any single statement could. Anaphora is also a memory device. People remember patterns more easily than standalone statements. If you want a key idea to stick in someone's mind long after your speech is over, wrapping it in a repeated structure is one of the most reliable ways to make that happen. The second device is antithesis, the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas in parallel grammatical structures. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Dickens. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Lincoln. Antithesis works because contrast creates clarity. When you put two opposing ideas in parallel structure, each one makes the other sharper. They define each other. The meaning of each half becomes clearer by the existence of the other half. And when both halves together constitute a complete and elegant thought, there's a satisfying click of recognition that audiences find almost physically pleasurable. Antithesis is also excellent for reframing. If you want to change how someone thinks about an issue, putting the old framing and the new framing in antithetical structure is a powerful way to do it. We don't have a healthcare problem, we have a priorities problem. The antithesis invites the audience to make the conceptual shift in real time, guided by the grammatical contrast.
The third device is the rule of three, the tricolon. 3 is the minimum number of items required to establish a pattern. 2 feels like a coincidence. 4 or more starts to feel like a list, but 3 feels complete. 3 has a rhythm, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Wait, that's 4. Actually, Churchill originally planned 3. Most political speechwriters know instinctively to reach for 3. When you're making a point, name 3 examples. When you're establishing a value, describe it in 3 dimensions. When you're building to a conclusion, give it 3 beats. The brain processes triads as complete, as satisfying, as finished, and that sense of completeness makes the idea feel more solid, more certain, more true. The fourth device is the rhetorical question, asking a question not to get an answer, but to direct the audience's thinking. How many more families have to struggle before we act? What kind of country leaves its children behind? Do we want to be the generation that watched it happen or the generation that made it stop? Rhetorical questions work because they create active engagement. When you ask a question, even a rhetorical one, the listener's brain automatically begins to answer it. They're not passive recipients anymore. They're thinking. And the thinking you've prompted them to do, if your question is well crafted, leads them naturally toward the conclusion you want them to reach. They arrive at your conclusion by their own cognitive pathway, which means it feels like their conclusion, not yours. And conclusions we feel we've reached ourselves carry far more conviction than conclusions we've been told to hold. The fifth device is the extended metaphor, building a sustained comparison between the issue at hand and something familiar, everyday, and universally understood. Political communicators use this constantly because it bridges the gap between abstract policy and lived experience. The economy is a machine that needs tuning. Democracy is a garden that needs tending. Education is an investment, not an expense. Each of these metaphors does real cognitive work. They activate existing knowledge structures in the listener's mind. They know how machines work. They know what happens to gardens that go untended. They know the difference between an expense and an investment. And by mapping the unfamiliar thing onto those familiar structures, the metaphor makes the unfamiliar thing suddenly comprehensible.
But metaphors are not neutral. Every metaphor frames the issue in a particular way, highlighting some aspects and obscuring others. If the economy is a machine, then the answer to economic problems is to find the broken part and fix it, a technical, mechanistic solution. If the economy is an ecosystem, the answer is more about balance and interdependence. The choice of metaphor is itself an argument, and skilled political communicators choose their metaphors with great intentionality. The sixth device is the pivot, the rhetorical move that acknowledges a contrary point and then turns it in a new direction. Yes, and. Great political communicators don't pretend opposing arguments don't exist. They engage them, acknowledge whatever is legitimate in them, and then redirect. My opponent is right that this will cost money. What they haven't told you is what it costs us not to do it. You're asking whether I can really achieve this, and that's a fair question. Here's what I'd ask you to consider. The pivot disarms the audience's skepticism by showing that you've heard it and engaged with it honestly. And it demonstrates confidence, the confidence of someone who isn't threatened by the opposing argument because they've thought through it and know how to answer it. Let me give you one more device before we move on, because this one is particularly underestimated. Concrete specificity. Not a named rhetorical device in the classical tradition, but in practice, one of the most persuasive things a political communicator can do. When you say, "I'll work hard for this community," you've said something that is true for virtually every candidate who has ever run for anything. It is unfalsifiable, unmemorable, and ultimately meaningless because it contains no specific information. But when you say, "My first act will be to hold a public meeting in every neighborhood in this district within my first 90 days in office," you've said something specific, something that can be evaluated, something that sets a real expectation, something that can be remembered and checked. Specific claims signal that you've done the thinking. They suggest that you understand the reality of the situation well enough to name concrete actions. They give audiences something to hold on to, a real tangible thing they can use to evaluate whether you mean what you say. And over time, the accumulation of specific, checkable claims and the consistency between what you said and what you did is the most reliable way there is to build real, lasting credibility.
What you can do is work the conditions. You can develop your understanding of the subject until it's deep enough that you can see the paradoxes and the tensions within it. You can practice compression. Take any important idea you hold and keep shortening it until you find the minimum words that contain maximum meaning. You can read the great political speeches, not to copy their lines, but to absorb the sound and rhythm of memorable language. You can give yourself enough time to revise, because almost no first draft produces the line. It emerges in the rewriting. And you can remember that memorable lines are anchored in genuine conviction. The lines that last are the ones that feel when you hear them, like they were wrung out of real belief, real experience, real stakes. They weren't performed, they were felt. And that felt quality, even across decades, even in a transcript, even out of their original context, is detectable. It's what makes them live. Handling adversity, the hostile question, the gotcha, the crisis. Here is where political communication gets really interesting and really applicable to everyday life, because the hardest communication isn't giving a prepared speech to a friendly audience. The hardest communication is staying coherent, credible, and composed when something goes wrong. When you're asked a question designed to trap you, when you're confronted with something you'd rather not address, when a crisis erupts and everyone is looking at you for answers you don't yet have. This is where great political communicators separate themselves from merely good ones, and the techniques they use are worth studying carefully. Let's start with the hostile question. In political media contexts, the hostile question is a specific art form. The interviewer has done their research. They've found the inconsistency, the flip-flop, the embarrassing vote, the damaging quote, the uncomfortable fact, and they're going to deploy it with maximum impact. The amateur response to a hostile question is one of three things: getting defensive, getting angry, or attempting an unconvincing deflection. All three of these responses signal the questioner's case for them. The defensive response signals that the question landed, that you were hurt by it. The angry response signals that you can't handle pressure, which raises exactly the questions about temperament that you least want raised. And the unconvincing deflection signals that you know you don't have a good answer, which is worse than acknowledging the difficulty of the question directly. The professional response to a hostile question almost always starts with the same move: acknowledge the legitimacy of the question. Not "that's a great question," that's a dodge dressed up as a compliment, but genuine acknowledgement of what's valid in the challenge. You're right that my position on this has evolved, and I think that's worth explaining. That acknowledgement does several things simultaneously. It demonstrates intellectual security. You're not rattled. It demonstrates honesty. You're not going to pretend the challenge doesn't exist. And it establishes the terms on which what follows will be heard. Instead of hearing your response through the filter of "they're trying to avoid the question," the audience now hears it through the filter of "they took the question seriously." After the acknowledgement comes the reframe. Not a dodge, but a genuine repositioning of the question in a larger context. You're asking about the vote I took in 2015. I want to give you a real answer to that, not just a defense. What I know now that I didn't know then is, or that's the right question to ask, and here's why I'd push back slightly on the framing of it. The reframe doesn't change the subject, it expands the context. It says, your question is asking about a piece of the picture, and I want to show you the whole picture. Sometimes that does, honestly, change how the piece looks, and sometimes the honest answer is, the piece looks exactly as bad as you think it does, and here's how I've responded to that. Which brings us to the most powerful move in the hostile question playbook, the genuine admission. I was wrong about this. My position changed because I learned something. I made a mistake, and here's what I did about it. This move is underused to a degree that borders on insane, given how effective it is. Voters, audiences, human beings in general are extraordinarily willing to forgive mistakes that are genuinely owned.
What they do not forgive is the performance of denial in the face of obvious evidence. They don't forgive being treated as though they can't see what they can clearly see. A genuine admission, offered without excessive self-flagellation, paired with an honest account of what was learned and what changed, that is one of the most trust-building moves in political communication. The gotcha moment is slightly different from the hostile question. The gotcha is designed not to elicit information, but to create an image, a clip, a headline, a moment. The gotcha works by isolating a response from its context and making it stand alone as the story. The classic gotcha is the out-of-context quote that makes a reasonable position sound unreasonable, or the compound question designed to be unanswerable without saying something damaging no matter which way you answer. The defense against the gotcha is what communication trainers call breaking the frame. You don't answer the question as posed, you name what's happening. Not accusatorially, not defensively, but clearly. I want to answer your question, but I also want to say something about how it's framed, because I think the framing itself is part of what we're talking about here. You've just made the question itself the subject, which gives you the room to redefine the terms before you answer. This requires confidence. It requires the willingness to not give the interviewer the clip they came for, which sometimes creates friction. But done calmly and without aggression, it is entirely legitimate and often results in a better, more substantive exchange than would have happened otherwise. Crisis communication is its own vast discipline, but there are a few foundational principles that great political communicators understand and that apply far beyond politics. The first principle, speed, matters more than perfect information. In a crisis, the temptation is to wait until you have all the facts before you say anything. The instinct is understandable. You don't want to have to walk back a statement because you said something inaccurate in the early chaos. But the cost of silence is almost always greater than the cost of an imperfect early statement. In the absence of a voice from the responsible party, other voices fill the vacuum, and those voices are almost never more favorable to you than your own would be. The crisis communication formula that works is acknowledge, commit, update. This is what I know right now. I acknowledge this is a serious situation that requires our full attention. Here is what we are committing to do, and I will give you a further update by this time. That's it. You don't need to have all the answers. You need to demonstrate that you're present, that you're taking it seriously, and that you're in motion. The second principle, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. This is a cliché because it is always, without exception, true. Whatever the crisis is, whatever the error, the failure, the embarrassment, the version of it that includes a cover-up is categorically more damaging than the original thing. Because the original thing is about what happened. The cover-up is about who you are. It suggests that you are someone who, faced with a serious situation, chooses deception over accountability. And that character judgment is much harder to recover from than any specific incident. The third principle, restore the human dimension as quickly as possible. In a political crisis, the temptation is to go immediately to process. We are convening a review, and we have appointed a task force, and our legal team is assessing. These things may be true and may be necessary, but they are deeply unsatisfying to people who have been hurt because they convert a human situation into an institutional one. The most effective crisis communicators find a way to restore the human dimension, to speak to the people affected as people, not as claimants in a process, to acknowledge the real impact, to say, I understand what this has cost you, and that matters to me not just as a policy matter, but as a human matter.
The power of narrative, why stories beat statistics every time. We touched on the power of story earlier, but it deserves its own extended treatment because it is the single most underused tool in the kit of the average communicator and the single most relied upon tool of the best ones. Here's what we know from neuroscience about what happens when you hear a story versus when you hear a statistic. When you process a fact or a figure,
Unemployment is at 6%. A relatively small number of brain regions activate. The language processing centers, the working memory. That's roughly it. But when you hear a story, when someone says, "Let me tell you about Marcus, who worked in that plant for 22 years and was told 3 days before his 58th birthday that the plant was closing," something completely different happens. Your brain processes it almost as though you are experiencing it. The sensory regions activate, the emotional centers activate, the regions associated with action and movement activate. You don't just understand Marcus's situation, you feel it. You are, in a neurological sense, briefly living it alongside him. This is why story is not just a nice supplement to data. Story is the medium through which human beings most naturally and most completely understand the world. Facts and figures describe reality. Stories let us inhabit it. And what we inhabit, we remember. What we remember, we act on. Political communicators have understood this intuitively for as long as politics has existed. The question, "And who is your neighbor?" is a story question. The parable of the prodigal son is a political communication strategy as much as it is a theological one. Every effective political movement in history has had a story at its center, a narrative about who the people are, where they've come from, what has been done to them, and what they can become.
Let me walk you through the structural anatomy of an effective political story, because this is something you can learn and apply. Every effective story in political communication has the same components. There is a protagonist, a specific, named, real person who stands in for the larger group you're speaking about. There is a world, a description of that person's life before the issue under discussion made itself felt. There is a disruption, the moment when the problem entered that person's world. There is a struggle, what the protagonist has done to cope, what they've lost, what it has cost them. And there is a stake, the question of what happens next, which is the question your policy, your proposal, your candidacy will answer. Notice what's absent from that list. Data. The story doesn't need data because the story itself is the data. It is a specific, verified instance of the general truth you're trying to communicate. You give the data after the story to establish the scale, to prove that this person is not an outlier, but a representative. Marcus is one of 50,000 people in this state who, but the data comes after to support what the story has already established emotionally. The story always comes first. There is another form of narrative that great political communicators use constantly, and it is often overlooked precisely because it is so pervasive: the national story, the collective narrative that defines who we are. Every effective political movement is built on a story about the group it speaks for. Here is who we are. Here is where we came from. Here is what we believe. Here is what we have endured. Here is what we are capable of. These collective narratives are extraordinarily powerful because they do something that individual stories and policy arguments cannot. They define identity. And identity is arguably the most powerful motivating force in human political behavior. People vote their identities before they vote their interests. They vote who they are before they vote what they want. When a political communicator can tell a story that makes someone feel, yes, that is who we are, that is our story, that is what this moment means, the political connection that creates is deep and durable in a way that position papers and policy plans can never match. The best version of this is when the national story being told is genuinely inclusive, when it defines the group broadly, when it acknowledges internal diversity and even contradiction while finding the through line of shared value. The worst version is when the national story is built on exclusion, when it defines the group by who is not in it, when it requires an enemy to have coherence, when its emotional power comes from resentment rather than aspiration.
That distinction, aspiration versus resentment, is one of the most important judgments you can make on any political narrative you encounter. Aspirational national stories say, here is what we can build, here is who we can become, here is the good that is possible if we do the work. Resentment-based national stories say, here is what has been taken from us, here is who took it, here is what they deserve. Both are politically potent, but only one of them builds, the other only burns.
The voice itself, delivery, cadence, and the body in political communication. We've been talking about language, about the words, the structure, the rhetoric. But a crucial part of political communication never appears on the page. It lives in the body, in the voice, in the space between words. And for many communicators, this is where the gap between the message they intend and the message the audience receives is largest. Let's start with pace. Most anxious speakers go too fast. It's a nearly universal nervous response. When we're uncomfortable, uncertain, or afraid of being interrupted, we speed up. We compress the pauses. We fill every available moment of silence with more words, as if silence were the enemy. But silence, specifically the deliberate pause, is one of the most powerful tools in the political communicator's delivery kit. The pause does several things. It emphasizes what came before it. It's the equivalent of an italic or a bold in written text. It signals to the audience that what just happened was important, that they should hold it and register it before moving on. It also provides a moment of genuine reflection for both the speaker and the audience, which creates the impression, usually accurate, of genuine thought rather than rote performance. The pause is also a dominance signal in the interpersonal dimension of communication. The person who can hold silence is the person who isn't afraid. The person who fills every silence is the person who is. When you can stand in front of a crowd after a key line and let the weight of it settle, not filling it, not rushing to the next thing, you are demonstrating a kind of ease that audiences find enormously reassuring. Watch any great political speech and count the pauses. You'll find that the most effective moments, the moments that produce the biggest audience responses, are almost always preceded by a pause. The speaker lets the line land, then they wait. Then, often, the crowd responds, and the speaker waits again, acknowledging the response without rushing past it. The rhythm of those pauses and that silence is a significant portion of why those speeches work. Cadence is the musical dimension of speech, the rise and fall of pitch, the variation in speed, the rhythmic patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. Great political speakers have cadence that is distinctive and often hypnotic. It pulls you in, it creates expectation, it modulates emotion. The key insight about cadence is that variation is engagement. A speaker who speaks at the same pace, the same pitch, and the same volume for any extended period of time will put an audience to sleep, regardless of what they're saying. The brain habituates quickly to any constant stimulus. To maintain attention, you need to vary. Speed up for urgency, excitement, the quick listing of evidence. Slow down for weight, for gravity, for the line you most need to land. Get quiet to draw people in, the counterintuitive truth that a lowered voice creates more attention than a raised one, because people lean in to hear what they might miss. Get loud to release the energy that's been building through the quiet parts.
The great political communicators use their voices like musicians use dynamics. They know when to build and when to resolve, when to intensify and when to release, when to bring the room to silence and when to let it explode. And that dynamic control is something that can be learned, not easily and not quickly, but with practice and attention, absolutely learnable. Body language in political communication deserves a book of its own, but let me give you the most important principles. Eye contact is trust. In one-on-one conversation, this is obvious. The person who can't make eye contact seems evasive or nervous. In a large group setting, the principle still applies, but it has to be managed differently.
The skill is making each individual in a large audience feel that you are speaking to them personally, not to the crowd as an undifferentiated mass. This is done by moving eye contact deliberately through the room, not scanning, but landing, making a specific person feel for 2 or 3 seconds that you are talking directly to them, then moving, then landing again somewhere else. The person you landed on will remember that moment, and the people around them will feel it too, because genuine eye contact is perceptible even to observers who aren't its direct recipient. Posture communicates authority. Slumping, shifting, fidgeting, all of these signal discomfort, and discomfort signals uncertainty, which undermines credibility. The upright, open, planted posture of someone who is comfortable in their body and comfortable in their authority is not something most people naturally have. It has to be practiced, because for most people, standing still and upright in front of others is in tension with the nervous impulse to make oneself smaller. Gesture, when it's natural, amplifies meaning. When it's scripted or artificial, it undermines it. The test of whether a gesture is natural is whether it would happen if no one were watching. If your hands naturally describe the shape of something when you're explaining it in private conversation, that gesture is yours. If you're doing something with your hands that you've been coached to do, but that doesn't arise naturally from what you're saying, an audience will detect the artificiality, usually without being able to name it. The overall principle of great political delivery is alignment. Your voice, your body, and your words need to be saying the same thing. When they are, when the message and the medium are congruent, there's an ease and a power that audiences feel as authenticity. When they're not aligned, when a speaker's words are saying, "I'm confident," but their body is saying, "I'm terrified," or when their words are saying, "I care deeply," but their voice has the flat affect of someone reading a menu, the audience feels the dissonance, and they don't trust what they don't understand.
The Framing Game: How Political Communicators Shape Reality. There is a concept in political communication that might be the most important and the most underappreciated of everything we've discussed so far. It is called framing, and once you understand it, really understand it, you will never hear a political speech, watch a news segment, or read a headline the same way again. Framing is the idea that how you describe a situation shapes how people think about it, what they believe is at stake in it, and what solutions seem appropriate for it. The same facts, framed differently, can produce completely opposite reactions. The same policy, named differently, can be popular or unpopular, depending on what language is used to describe it. Here's a famous example from political science research. The same policy was described to 2 groups of participants. One group was told that the policy allowed doctors to save 200 of 600 patients. The other group was told the policy would mean 400 of 600 patients would die. Mathematically, these are identical outcomes, but the groups responded very differently. The first group, given the gain frame, favored the policy. The second group, given the loss frame, did not. Identical facts, opposite responses. The only variable was the frame. Political communicators understand this at a deep level, and they spend enormous energy on the language of framing. Is it a death tax or an estate tax? Is it illegal immigration or undocumented immigration? Is a regulation protecting consumers or strangling businesses? Is the military budget an investment in national security or military spending? None of these framings is necessarily dishonest, but each one emphasizes different aspects of a complex reality, and that emphasis shapes perception. Understanding framing matters for 2 reasons. First, because it makes you a more sophisticated consumer of political communication. You can hear when framing is being deployed and assess for yourself whether the frame is appropriate to the reality it's describing. Second, because it makes you a more effective communicator. You can be intentional about the frames you use, choosing language that emphasizes what you genuinely believe is most important about a situation.
The concept of reframing is the political communicator's tool for challenging an opponent's narrative. When an opponent has successfully established a frame that works against you, you don't argue within that frame, you replace it. You don't accept the terms, you introduce new terms. The classic example, during the Reagan era, opponents of the nuclear arms race were losing the argument when they framed it as arms reduction, a term that suggested weakness, giving up, falling behind. A communications consultant suggested reframing it as a nuclear freeze, stopping where both sides were, which seemed less like reduction and more like parity. The reframe didn't change the policy, it changed the emotional associations attached to the policy, and it changed the political conversation. The test of a good reframe is whether it captures something genuinely true about the situation that the original frame was obscuring. A reframe that is purely cynical, that deploys misleading language to make a bad thing seem good, will eventually fail, because eventually the reality behind the language asserts itself. But a reframe that illuminates a genuinely important dimension of a situation that has been overlooked or suppressed, that is doing real intellectual and communicative work. Practice noticing frames. The next time you read a news article or watch a political speech, ask yourself, how is this situation being described? What is being foregrounded? What is being backgrounded? Whose perspective does this framing serve? And what would this situation look like if described from a different frame? That exercise, done consistently, will make you a sharper thinker and a more precise communicator, because thinking carefully about the language you use to describe things is itself a form of thinking carefully about the things.
The digital dimension, political communication in the social media age. Everything we've talked about so far is timeless. The principles of ethos, pathos, and logos are as relevant in the age of TikTok as they were in Athens. The three-part structure of problem, cause, solution works in a tweet thread as well as it works in a convention speech. Human beings process information and emotion the same way they always have. But the medium has changed, and the medium shapes the message in ways that deserve specific attention. The most fundamental change that digital media has made to political communication is the collapse of editorial gatekeeping. For most of the 20th century, political messages had to pass through intermediaries, newspapers, television broadcasters, radio stations, before they reached audiences. Those intermediaries had standards, fact-checking processes, imperfect ones but still, and space constraints that imposed a certain discipline on political communication. You couldn't say 30 things at once and expect them all to get through. You had to choose. Digital media has removed that constraint almost entirely. Politicians can now speak to their audiences directly without any intermediary at all. They can say as many things as they want, as often as they want, in whatever format they choose. This creates enormous opportunities for authentic communication, the ability to go long, to go deep, to show personality and humanity in ways that a 30-second television spot never allowed. But it also creates enormous risks, because the constraint that editorial gatekeeping imposed, the discipline of having to choose what to say and having it evaluated before it reached the public, is gone. And for communicators who lack internal discipline, the result is a kind of communicative chaos. Too many messages, too many formats, too much volume, and none of it cuts through. The paradox of the digital age in political communication is that having more channels to reach people has in many ways made it harder to actually reach them, because every channel is competing with every other channel for a finite supply of human attention. And attention in the digital age is the scarcest resource there is. What cuts through in this environment? The same things that have always cut through, but more so. Specificity, authenticity, emotional resonance, and crucially, visual storytelling. Political communicators who are succeeding in the digital age have almost universally learned to think visually. They understand that most people, most of the time, are consuming content on their phones, often without sound, often while doing something else.
A speech that works beautifully as an audio experience may not translate at all to someone scrolling through video with the sound off. A written statement that is clear and logical in long form may be completely passed over when it appears as a wall of text in a social feed. The adaptation required is not a dumbing down of the content, it's a translation into different sensory vocabularies. A chart or a map that makes complex data visually immediate, a short video clip that shows rather than tells, a carefully constructed still image that captures an emotional truth at a glance. These are not replacements for substantive communication. They are entry points. They are what earns the attention that the substantive communication then receives.
There is also, in the digital age, a completely new dimension of political communication that has no real historical precedent: the back-channel conversation, the comment section, the reply thread, the direct message, the live stream chat. These spaces represent the first time in history that political communicators and their audiences have been able to have anything resembling a real two-way conversation at scale. Most political communication professionals treat this back channel as a problem to be managed, a hostile commentary, bad press, viral moments of the wrong kind. And yes, it can be all of those things. But the communicators who are genuinely adapting to this environment are treating it as a resource, as an ongoing, real-time version of the quote audit we discussed earlier. The comments and replies are people telling you in their own words, in real time, what they think, what they feel, what they need, what they don't understand, what they're afraid of. That is invaluable intelligence for anyone who wants to communicate effectively with those people. The temptation in digital political communication is virality, the desire to say something that will be shared widely, that will reach beyond your existing audience, that will break through the noise. And virality is real, and it can be powerful, but the pursuit of virality as a primary communication goal almost always corrupts the communication, because the things that go viral are rarely the things that are most true or most important. They tend to be the things that are most extreme, most emotionally inflammatory, most divisive, and optimizing for those qualities moves your communication away from authenticity and toward performance. The most sustainable strategy in digital political communication is not to chase virality. It's to build a genuine community of people who trust you enough to pay attention, share widely, and advocate on your behalf. That community is built the same way trust has always been built, through consistency, honesty, genuine engagement, and the willingness to say hard, true things, even when the easy, false things would get more clicks.
Ethics in political communication, the line between persuasion and manipulation. I want to spend some real time here because this conversation is incomplete without it. Everything we've discussed, the rhetorical techniques, the framing, the emotional storytelling, the message discipline, all of it can be used in the service of truth, and all of it can be used in the service of deception. The tools don't care how they're used. The same knife that prepares a meal can do harm. The same persuasion techniques that have helped great leaders build great things have been used by demagogues to destroy them. So where is the line? How do you know when persuasion becomes manipulation? Here's my best attempt at a clear definition of the difference. Persuasion works by helping someone see a truth they hadn't seen before, or by helping them feel the full weight of a truth they'd intellectually acknowledged but emotionally undervalued. Manipulation works by exploiting cognitive biases, emotional vulnerabilities, or information asymmetries to lead someone toward a conclusion that they would reject if they were thinking clearly and had access to all the relevant facts. The key distinction is the thinking clearly and had access to all the relevant facts part. Ethical persuasion survives scrutiny. It actually wants the audience to think clearly and have access to all the relevant facts, because the ethical persuader is confident that the conclusion holds up under those conditions.
Manipulation specifically requires that the audience not think clearly, not have access to all the facts, not subject the conclusion to scrutiny, because the conclusion doesn't hold up. In practice, the markers of manipulation in political communication include claims that can't be verified and that the speaker isn't trying to verify, emotional appeals that are disproportionate to or disconnected from the actual facts of the situation, framing that deliberately obscures important information while foregrounding less important information, appeals to fears about threats that are either not real or vastly exaggerated, and the deliberate creation of an us versus them dynamic as the primary motivating force. That last one deserves particular attention. There is nothing inherently wrong with identifying genuine conflicts of interest and genuine adversarial relationships. These exist, and naming them honestly is part of honest political communication. But there is a specific version of us versus them politics that is almost definitionally manipulative, the version where the them is defined by identity rather than by behavior, where an entire category of people is treated as an undifferentiated threat, where the emotional energy of the communication is primarily fear and contempt rather than genuine concern about specific actions or policies.
This kind of communication is manipulative because it works by activating tribal psychology, the deeply embedded human tendency to trust the in-group and distrust the out-group, and directing it toward targets that may not warrant the hostility the communication manufactures. It works in the sense that it generates strong emotional responses and strong loyalty, but what it builds is not genuine understanding or genuine community. It's a solidarity based on shared hostility, and solidarities built on shared hostility are inherently fragile and inherently corrosive to the broader social fabric. The ethical political communicator draws real lines. They name real problems. They identify real actors who have done real things that deserve real scrutiny. But they do not manufacture enemies for the purpose of galvanizing their base. They do not simplify complex situations to the point of distortion in order to make the emotional case cleaner. They do not tell people what they want to hear at the expense of what they need to hear. And this brings us to the hardest ethical challenge in political communication, which is the challenge of difficult truths. Sometimes the honest message is not the popular message. Sometimes the thing that needs to be said is the thing that an important part of your audience does not want to hear. Sometimes message discipline means being clear about something uncomfortable rather than hedging it into palatability. The great political communicators have historically been the ones who were willing to say the hard thing. Not all the time, not gratuitously, not performatively, but at the moments when a difficult truth needed to be spoken and speaking it required real courage, the ones who are remembered and respected are the ones who spoke it. There is a phrase sometimes attributed to various political figures, but essentially understood as a universal rule. The first duty of a politician is to get elected. The cynical implication is that winning comes first, and the communication necessary to win must take priority over the honest truth. But I'd argue this framing gets it precisely backwards. The first duty of a political communicator, of anyone whose words are intended to move people, is to be trustworthy. And trustworthiness is built by saying true things, including the hard ones, over time. Short-term manipulation may win elections, but it corrodes the capacity of citizens to trust any public voice at all, including your own. And a political environment where no one is trusted is an environment where nothing good can be built.
Authenticity, the quality that makes or breaks everything. We've come to the piece that, in some ways, I wanted to hold for last. Because everything we've discussed, the structure, the rhetoric, the message discipline, the delivery, the framing, all of it is scaffolding. And scaffolding without a real building inside it is nothing. It's just structure in empty space. The building is authenticity, And authenticity in political communication is the most misunderstood quality in the entire field. Most discussions of authenticity in politics quickly devolve into a kind of nostalgic fantasy about some pre-strategic era when politicians just spoke from the heart and everything was real and unmanaged. That era never existed. Pericles had speechwriters. Lincoln revised and rewrote. Churchill practiced his delivery obsessively, pausing between sentences, not because he was thinking of what to say, but because he had already thought of it and was now deploying it with precision. Strategic political communication is as old as political communication itself. So authenticity is not the absence of preparation, of strategy, of craft. Authenticity is not the opposite of skill. In fact, the preparation and skill are usually what makes authentic communication possible, because without them, you're too anxious, too reactive, too preoccupied with the mechanics to actually be present. Authenticity in the context of political communication is the quality of genuine alignment between who you are, what you believe, and what you say. It's not performance of sincerity, it's actual sincerity, communicated through language and behavior that is both skillful and genuinely grounded in conviction. Audiences are extraordinarily sensitive to inauthenticity, even when they can't articulate what they're detecting. They feel the gap between what someone is saying and who that person actually is. They sense the performance behind the words. And once they sense it, it's very difficult to unsense. Trust, once fractured, is hard to rebuild. This is why the foundation of effective political communication is not rhetorical skill. It is the hard, long, sometimes uncomfortable work of knowing what you actually believe, why you believe it, and what you're willing to stand for when the standing is costly. Many political communicators, many communicators of any kind, start their public life with genuine conviction. They entered the arena for real reasons, believed real things, cared about real issues. And then, gradually, through the accumulated pressures of political life, the need to fundraise, to please constituencies, to survive negative press cycles, to navigate complex coalitions, that original conviction gets sanded down. The sharp edges get smoothed. The difficult positions get softened. The authentic voice gets replaced, piece by piece, with something safer, more palatable, more calculated. And audiences feel that erosion. They may not be able to name it, but they feel the difference between a speaker whose words feel fully inhabited and a speaker who has become, at some level, a spokesperson for a persona rather than a voice for a genuine self.
The protection against this erosion is self-awareness. It is the practice of regularly asking, do I still believe this? Does this still represent my actual thinking, or am I saying it because it's what I've always said, or because it's what I'm supposed to say? Is there a gap between what I say in public and what I think in private? And if so, what does that gap tell me? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are the questions that keep a communicator's voice alive, that keep it honest, that keep it worth hearing. The other dimension of authenticity in political communication is the willingness to let yourself be seen. Not everything, not without judgment, not indiscriminately, but enough of the real person, the doubts, the learning, the genuine passion, the moments of genuine humor or genuine grief, that the audience can see that there is a human being behind the positions and the talking points. This is different from the strategic deployment of vulnerability, which you can smell a mile away. This is the unscripted moment that reveals character, the answer to a question that departs from the prepared line because the prepared line isn't quite true enough, the laugh that escapes because something genuinely strikes you as funny, the silence before a hard answer because the question genuinely required thought. These moments cannot be manufactured. They can only be created by being genuinely present,
by not being so protected behind craft and strategy that the real person has been walled off entirely. And the balance between craft and presence, between skillful communication and genuine humanity, is, ultimately, what separates the truly great political communicators from the merely technically proficient ones. The great ones are fully prepared and fully present. They have done every bit of the strategic work, and then they set it aside and speak as themselves, informed and organized by that work, but not imprisoned by it. They let the preparation serve the authenticity rather than replace it. That is the standard, not easy to reach, possible to aspire to, worth every bit of the work required to get there.
Bringing it together, your own communicative voice. Let's close with something practical, because everything we've discussed, as rich as it is theoretical until you put it to work in your own communication. And the question isn't just how you understand political speech. The question is what this means for how you speak. Here's what I want you to take away. The principles we've covered aren't about becoming a politician. They're about becoming a more effective, more honest, more impactful communicator in any context where your words need to carry weight. The first application: know what you believe before you speak. The single most common communication failure I observe in people of all backgrounds and contexts is speaking without having done the internal work of figuring out what you actually think. Before any important communication, a meeting where you're making a case, a difficult conversation, a presentation to a skeptical audience, take the time to answer 3 questions for yourself. What do I actually believe about this situation? What do I most need this person or this audience to understand? And what would I need to say for this communication to feel honest and complete, regardless of how it's received? Those 3 questions are your preparation. They produce your message. And having clear answers to them is the difference between a communication that feels fully inhabited and one that feels uncertain, even to you as you're delivering it. The second application: find the human story in everything you're communicating about. Whatever the subject, whether it's a policy, a plan, a product, a proposal, find the human being whose life is most directly and most clearly affected by it. Tell their story first, then build the analysis around that story. This is not a departure from rigorous thinking. It is rigorous thinking with an emotional foundation that allows it to be received. The third application: simplify ruthlessly, but never at the expense of truth. Great communicators are not simple-minded. They have done all the complex thinking, but they know that complexity communicated without translation is just noise. The work is to take genuine complexity and find the clear, simple, accurate statement that captures its essence, while being honest about where the simplification has to be qualified and where the full complexity genuinely matters. The fourth application: practice the pause. In your next presentation, your next important conversation, your next high-stakes communication, practice not filling the silence. Say something important, then stop. Let it be in the room for a moment. Notice what happens. The answer will almost always be that it lands harder than anything you could have said to follow it up immediately. The fifth application: ask yourself always whether you're trying to persuade or manipulate. Are you making the best honest case for what you genuinely believe, or are you strategically deploying information and emotion to achieve an outcome you haven't fully justified to yourself? The line between these is not always clear, but the habit of asking the question keeps you on the right side of it more often. The sixth application: develop your voice by developing yourself. Authentic communication flows from an authentic person. The best long-term investment you can make in your communication is the investment in your own thinking, reading widely, engaging with views different from your own, being willing to change your mind when the evidence warrants it, and doing the work of knowing at any given moment what you actually believe and why.
Political speech, at its best, is not a performance. It's not a series of techniques applied to a strategic objective. It is a person standing in front of other people saying what they believe about the world and what they think should be done about it with as much clarity, precision, skill, and honesty as they can bring to bear. The techniques we've covered, the structure, the rhetoric, the framing, the delivery, are all in service of that fundamental act. They're not shortcuts around the hard work of genuine conviction. They're ways of making genuine conviction fully communicable, fully felt, fully acted upon. Because the sad truth is that the world is full of people who genuinely believe good things and cannot communicate them, who care deeply and cannot make others feel that care, who have important ideas and cannot make those ideas land. And the world is also full of people who believe convenient things and can communicate them brilliantly. And in the contest between those two kinds of people, communication skill is not a trivial advantage. It is often the decisive one. So learn this craft, practice it rigorously, take it seriously, but never let the craft become more important than the conviction it's supposed to serve. Never let the strategy become more important than the truth it's supposed to express. Never become so skilled at managing your message that you lose track of what the message actually is. The world needs people who can do both, who have something real to say and the skill to say it in a way that reaches people, who combine genuine conviction with genuine craft, who can stand up and speak about the things that matter in the way that connects with the integrity that makes it worth hearing. That is the highest expression of political communication, and it is available to anyone willing to do the work. So here's the challenge. Go back through everything we've covered today, the foundational structure, the audience research, the three-part problem-cause-solution spine, the message discipline, the Rhetoric Toolkit, ethos, pathos, logos, anaphora, antithesis, the rule of three, rhetorical questions and extended metaphors, concrete specificity and the pivot, the art of the memorable line, the handling of hostile questions in crises, the power of narrative and collective story, the voice, the body, the pause, the cadence, the framing game, the digital dimension, the ethics, the authenticity. And then pick one thing, one technique, one principle, one shift, something that you know in reading it or hearing it that you've been missing, something where you recognized a gap between what you're currently doing and what you could be doing, and commit to practicing that one thing in your next important communication. Just one thing, just the next time, and then the thing after that. That's how craft is built. Not in some massive overhaul of your entire communicative identity, but in the accumulation of small, intentional choices to do the thing better than you did it last time. Political speech at its best is one of the most powerful forces for good that human beings have ever developed. It has moved nations. It has ended wars. It has built coalitions that seemed impossible and dismantled injustices that seemed permanent. It has named the unnamed, given voice to the voiceless, and described futures that then became realities because enough people heard them described and decided to build them. That power is real, and now you understand how it works. Use it well.
Conclusion. The commitment beneath the craft. We started this exploration by pushing back against the cynical image of political speech, the dodge, the spin, the polished nothing. And yes, that version exists, and it deserves all the cynicism it gets. But that version is a corruption of something that, in its honest form, is one of the most important human activities there is. At its core, political speech is the act of a person trying to convince other people to see the world a certain way and act on that vision together. It is fundamentally a cooperative act. It is an attempt to build shared understanding, shared purpose, shared will. The techniques and structures we have explored are all in service of that fundamental cooperative project.
The politician who speaks well and honestly is not manipulating their audience. They are doing them the honor of trying to communicate as clearly, as fully, and as compellingly as they're able. They are saying, I have thought about this, I believe this deeply, and I care enough about you and about the shared world we inhabit to spend the effort and craft required to make sure you really understand what I am trying to say. That is a gift. And receiving it well as an audience means bringing the same care and rigor to the listening that the speaker has brought to the speaking. It means thinking critically, not just emotionally. It means evaluating evidence as well as feeling resonance. It means being willing to be moved, but not being willing to be swept away without scrutiny. Great political communication deserves a great political audience, and great political audiences are built the same way great political communicators are built, through practice, through education, through the ongoing commitment to engage seriously with the public life we all share. That is the final point. All of this craft, all of this strategy and structure and rhetoric exists not in isolation, but in a relationship, the speaker and the listener, the communicator and the community. And the health of that relationship determines whether political speech fulfills its best potential or degrades into its worst. We each have a role in that relationship. The communicators have the responsibility to be honest, to be prepared, to be worthy of the trust they ask for. The audience has the responsibility to listen critically, to reward honesty over performance, and to hold communicators accountable to the standards they claim. Together, those two halves of the relationship are what make political communication worth having at all, worth studying, worth practicing, worth fighting to keep honest and keep alive.
The long game, how great communicators sustain their voice over time. There is one final dimension of political communication that we have not yet fully addressed, and it is the one that separates the communicators who matter for a moment from the ones who matter for a generation. It is the long game. Every political communicator eventually faces a question that is not about rhetoric or structure or delivery. It is a character question. Who do you remain when the pressure is high and the rewards for compromising your message are enormous? Because here is the reality that the training manuals do not tend to cover. Communication skill without anchoring values tends to drift over time. It tends to find the path of least resistance, the argument that tests best, the language that generates the most applause. And each individual drift is small. Each individual accommodation seems reasonable. But the accumulated trajectory of those drifts can take a communicator very far from where they started and from who they genuinely are. The political communicators who sustain genuine authority over time, not just electoral success, but the deep, durable credibility that means people listen when they speak, are the ones who have developed a consistent relationship with their own core convictions. They know what they believe deeply enough to notice when they are being asked to betray it, and they have made, at some level, a prior commitment to not betraying it. This does not mean rigidity. Growing, learning, updating your views based on new evidence, these are signs of intellectual health, not weakness. The communicator who has held exactly the same positions for 40 years, unchanged by experience or evidence, has not maintained their integrity, they have ossified. Real integrity is dynamic. It is the ongoing, active commitment to honesty about what you know, what you do not know, and what you have learned. What changes over time for great political communicators is not the core values, it is the expression of them, the increasingly refined ability to articulate what they believe with greater precision, greater depth, greater range of example and connection. The conviction stays constant. The craft of expressing that conviction keeps growing. And that combination,
Deepening conviction expressed with maturing craft is what produces the voices that history remembers, not the slickest communicators of their era, not the ones who scored best in focus groups, the ones who had something genuinely important to say and spent a lifetime getting better and better at saying it. That is the standard. It is a long standard and a high one. It asks of you not just the mastery of technique, but the cultivation of character. Not just skillful speaking, but the development of something worth saying. Not just the ability to reach people, but the commitment to be worthy of their trust once you have reached them. There is also something worth saying about the relationship between the communicator and the audience over time. In a single speech or interview, the audience is relatively passive, receiving, but political communicators who operate over years and decades are in something more like an ongoing conversation with their public, a relationship. And relationships are governed by the same fundamental rules that all relationships are governed by: consistency, honesty, follow-through, and the willingness to be present and accountable even when it is uncomfortable.
People watch what you do as much as they listen to what you say. They notice whether your actions align with your words. They track the gap between the promised and the delivered. They observe how you treat people when the cameras are not on, when there is nothing to gain, when the only reason to behave well is that it is the right thing to do. And they draw conclusions from all of that observation that become the real foundation of whether they trust you. This is why the most effective political communication strategy over the long run is simply to live in a way that is consistent with what you say, to close the gap between the public voice and the private person, to be the same in the difficult, unobserved moments as you are in the polished, prepared ones. That alignment, when it exists, produces a quality of credibility that no amount of rhetorical skill can manufacture, because it is not manufactured, it is simply real. The techniques and strategies we have explored throughout this conversation are tools. They are excellent tools, the best tools available for the specific task of communicating complex ideas in a way that is clear, compelling, emotionally resonant, and action-inspiring. But tools are only as good as the hands that hold them, and the purpose those hands serve. The purpose is yours to determine. The character is yours to build. And the work begins the next time you open your mouth and decide in that moment to say something real.